I also wanted to ask you a two-part question. You can answer the first part first. Um, so when you're doing this type of book and you're beginning with this contrast between the large and the small, and you mentioned flies. I think one of the key lines of the novel is the deeds of fleas can so perversely affect the lives of pachyderms. Uh, do you are you consciously looking for little symbols later on that you can kind of sustain that metaphor? And I'm not just speaking about this one particular metaphor, because there are other devices used that you bring up later on too.
No, I mean it all depends on the moment. If I'd written a certain segment a different day, I might have done something else. Instead of talking about, say, the green toss or the canyon, I might have had some other intro to a chapter. If I had not come up with the repetition of Tony, Luft, and Buster Crab, I would have had to come up with something else to fill it in. I generally, with works, know the overall arch of something, but I don't know the particulars. I'll give you a good example with, even though it's a different book, the spy book that I wrote. I wanted to end my spy book the way that La Dolce Vita, the film, ended. I wanted to have the main character not understanding something and another character explaining to him. But instead of having the Marcello Mastroianni character, the spy like Mastroianni, not hearing a girl speak to him over the roar of an ocean after they discover this manta ray or something. I have the main character, the spy, having a vision of this art forger, Elmir Dahori, trying to explain to him something after he's recounted meeting Dahori years earlier about art, and we see the art forger holding up a blank canvas as the spy takes a bus in Brooklyn and is going away, and he can't figure out what's going on, and it's a great kind of metaphor that ends that book. But I didn't know that because I wrote the first 20. It's 27 chapters. I wrote chapter 1 and 27 the last. I wrote the 25 chapters in between first because that's the bulk of the book. But I knew how I was going to start the book with the cat getting run over, and I knew I wanted to end in the La Dolce Vita fashion. But until that day that I sat down and wrote it, I didn't have any idea. It just came to me. I said, "Well, let me bring in this art forger, Elmir Dahori. That would be a great symbol." It just comes to me, and it's because I'm constantly thinking of these things weeks and months in advance that when I get to the moment of decision, I've already gone through 200 or 300 options, and I know the best 2 or 3 options. So I don't have this bullshit that people talk about, having a writer's block, because I'm constantly thinking of it. I'm next week I'm going to be starting a new job, but it's a job that at least after a week or so of learning whatever bullshit I have to learn, my mind will be free for the next 6 months or a year until I can get something better. But I will be constantly going through these things, running through these scenarios, so that when it comes to make a decision on something, I just have 2 or 3. I've already culled out 2 or 300 lesser options, and I've just got 2 or 3 options, and it's just what strikes me of those 2 or 3 at the moment as the best option.
To kind of rest on the framing technique too, I'll just read this and then I'll show the parallax kind of how the prose goes. You are here. Here is now, even if it's then, and you are here now. Now here for the far wars of a former life, or for another to live, to hop in the carnival cars of a roller coaster named you. For you are the game, Polly Marabelli is the ride, and this is the place where the goofy grinned amusement park employee locks you into your seat so you don't tumble to earth. Or you got a typo here, or solid, or the place where canyons have torsos, green or lavender, and you are the sovereign, the lord of many moments, the deep pool of an end unheard. Sometime in the far future, a small insect will rest upon the undistracted ear flap of a creature you sense you know but realize you just assume the knowledge of. Its flatulence will fill your nose as the insect dares to ear's end, flutters in the push of some, and lazily wafts into the air, full on the obvious that it was the canyon grown pensive on the discovery that it had dreamt that you were its heir. And then it connects to morning, eyes open, Polly awake, his jaw hurt, a fart is free, time goes on.
Yeah.
So there's some amusing little contrast there in Parallax in how although there's some humor in the first paragraph, it's very poetic, and then this more humorous little line is introduced.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a good way to transition. That this is where the dentist comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And the dentist was connected to Paulie in his childhood too, if I recall right.
he, I think he earlier on, maybe not childhood, but early youth and whatnot. Um, and it's Maravelli. It's not Maravelli. It's Maravelli. If you called an Italian with a name like that, Maravelli, you get slapped. It's Maravelli.
Or shivved, as you say.
Yeah.
Um, but talk a little bit about Dennis. That's one of the more humorous incidents.
Well, I
Before
think
we
that
move on.
the dentist. I'm just trying to remember. The dentist is his connection to Lou Wasserman. I think. Yeah,
Yes.
Lou. And here's another example where I take a guy who was one of the biggest Hollywood agents of the 30s and 40s. In the 50s and 60s, we get later on. They talk about the octopus that was his. I forget which studio he took over, but so he takes over the studio. He's connected to the Chicago outfit, the Al Capone's people after Capone died, and so he has all these connections. Wasserman, he I guess Wasserman uses the same dentist too. I think they all met in Cleveland again, and it's just a way to connect these things up because when I look up stuff and when I'm writing over a 17-month period, I'm watching things. Lou Wasserman came to me because I saw a documentary where he was mentioned, uh, Lou Wasserman as a super agent. I said, and he's from Cleveland. I said, oh, I've got a lot of things set in Cleveland. He's in the right time period. Let's throw him in the book. And so, how do you get Wasserman in the book? Well, we could make him. We're going to tie him to Jack Ruby, and that ties him to the Foundation. And the Foundation, we found out later, are the ones who killed JFK. And one of the really great things in this book is here we have the murder of JFK. It's not central to the book. It's a very small little thing. And the reason that we find out in this universe that JFK was murdered was as a distraction so that people would be focused on the murder of the president, and then a few days later, the foundation launches this attack where they kill 30 or 40 mobsters and they take over the New York waterfront. And that's the reason that they killed JFK. It had nothing to do with JFK in this book. But the dentist serves as a way to connect these things together. And it's just one of those things that I always say it's the organic things. When you're people who overplot books, you're gonna see the creaky artifice. When you're writing and things are just coming and you can pull them together and you have the talent and the ability to do that. This is why these books, Vincetti Brothers, this book, my Western book, even earlier books like Tumbleweeds or Bit of Golem, even though Bit of Golem is by no means in a league with some of these larger books of mine, Bit of Golem is maybe only a notch below the top novels of all time. I mean, it's a great little book, but it's because these things are written organically, and I've gotten bigger and better at using these organic techniques. The stuff gets better. This is why even most of the great novels, you can still see some artifice in it. Most of this, you don't see the artifice. Yes, you see the artifice of using the filmic techniques, but when I'm talking about artifice, I'm talking within the diegetic universe. These things, the mentioning of Lou Wasserman is perfectly rational. It would be odd if he wasn't in this book when you think about it, if you know who that was and how big an impact he had on Hollywood in the middle 20th century.
Something like Moby Dick, you can see the artifice in, but you kind of go with it regardless. Would you include something like that in your example?
To a degree, like here in this chapter, I'll give you an example. Here they're talking about TV shows, and we find out that Paulie doesn't know what the latest TV shows of the early '60s are. So that they're talking about the television schedule, and Paulie's about 5 or 10 years behind the times, and so it shows you how focused Paulie is, and so that's a good idea of characterization here. This talk about the television shows that are popular in the early 1960s here shows how focused Paulie is on the things that he wants. And Paulie has obviously succeeded because he's very focused on things. And we see this become Paulie Maravelli, in a sense, to just use the Moby Dick, is sort of the Ahab of the book. You know, he's focused on this goal of getting his family legitimized within the criminal element, and he's blind to the machinations of Big Frank working against him, and that's what ends up just like Ahab. He goes down like Ahab because he's got his eyes focused on the wrong thing.
For as great as Moby Dick is, though, even the ending scene, uh, Ahab's last monologue towards it is full of artifice. I don't think artifice necessarily is a bad thing, but when you can see it, it certainly lessens the impact in terms of its realism. And this is something that you don't necessarily see in Norwegian, and when you do, it's kind of inverted later on. There's a section where there's this soap operatic almost incident occur, and then you realize that the narrator points out the absurdity of it, and then characters will interrupt each other, whereas characters in Moby Dick, they'll go on long poetic monologues that you don't really expect of whalemen and vicious bastards like Ahab. So I want to ask you the second part of my question. The When you mentioned The Fly, it made me think of Jessica's book Sparrow Country, and you also mentioned the influence of Steppenwolf. I don't think that you see. I didn't even make that connection with Steppenwolf with A Norwegian in the Family and The Norwegian in the Family, because the influence is almost completely gone because it's taken to a whole different level. Similarly, if I did not know it, the fly that she uses in Sparrow Country, as opposed to the one used in Norwegian, is used completely differently. She uses one of her poems, Moth Lost in the Laboratory, and connects it with that way, whereas the way that you do it is completely different and much more attuned to the realism, whereas hers is more consciously poetic.
Well, Jessica's great in a different way. I was telling her yesterday. I told you before. Jessica writes beautiful prose. That's she has probably the strongest, most poetic prose line within the thing. I do it in a different things. I build poesy in big chunks. The difference is Jessica. If you use an architectural model, Jessica builds with sort of small little building blocks. I'm building like the Great Pyramids. I've got these huge 30-ton blocks that I'm putting into place. Jessica is using small bricks and mortar, and so Jessica, she can have in let's say one of her walls, she can have an interesting design that I'm not going to necessarily have, but I'm going to. We're sort of like fractals. Jessica does me in a smaller mode, and I do her in a larger mode. My stories are bigger. My characters are bigger, and my characters are are going to be coming upon their realizations of things in offhanded ways. Jessica's characters, generally speaking, are smarter. They're more educated. They're more classic, fictive characters. Jessica's characters are more Ingmar Bergman. Mine are more Cassavetes or Scorsese.
Yeah, hers focuses more on the individual characters, whereas yours is always branching out, and in a way, it's more conscious of the time that you're creating there, whereas hers is more focused on the individual characters.